name's Maurice Nagington. I'll just give you a little bit of background to me and how I actually ended up doing this project. So my background's in nursing. I'm a qualified nurse, and I worked in palliative care hospice settings for several years. The kind of empirical focus of my study was looking at district nurses, the patients and their carers' experiences of district nursing and what to them gave kind of a quality care for them. So that was the empirical focus, but the actual kind of analytical focus I wanted to look at in a very different, novel way. So I didn't want to kind of do a thematic analysis and go, this is what people say is quality, so that must be what it is. And that's kind of the whole point of discourse analysis, that you look at what's being said and you try and look at how why is that the case, and how are things being structured so that's what people actually come out and say. So the kind of this front page is an example of the really wide range of things that I pulled on. So I pulled on a lot of ethical theory, particularly Judith Butler, who's on there somewhere, and then obviously interviews with patients, but then also kind of a lot of sort of political and social theory as well. So Tim Dean's one example, and his work's around kind of the culture of gay male sex in New York and San Francisco, and you'll learn how that's relevant in a bit. But the point of the sort of discourse analysis I did is that it allows you a kind of huge range to connect different texts. Oh, that's really... Oh, there we go. Right. So I'm not going to give you a full potted history of discourse analysis because it does go back a long way. It goes back to roughly about 1930s. But really, today, the talk title said I'm talking about post-structural. Some people use the word postmodern. It's not a vast amount of difference from this point of view of discourse analysis. So I'm talking about post-structural discourse analysis today. Just so I'm clear about what I'm not really going into, even though you'll see that the term discourse analysis used for them, you'll sometimes see conversation analysis, and that very much focuses on the real minutiae of how conversations occur. I'm not focusing, though I did sort of use, I'm not focusing on thematic analysis or any other type of kind of qualitative analysis. But there are many, many possible understandings of what discourse is. And there's a chap called Michael Foucault. He famously wrote a whole book about it without really answering the question. It's not that thick. And you go, what is it? The closest you can get is that he kind of states at one point, discourse is institutionalized patterns of knowledge that become manifest in disciplinary structures and operate by the connection of knowledge and power. So basically what he's trying to say by that is that discourse is the structuring conditions that function on an institutional level, but then people have taken that slightly further. So I know that reference says 2002 on it, but that's just when it was translated into English. Modern kind of philosophers have taken that slightly further and said, well, discourse isn't just situation institutions, but it's actually something that we constantly perform and do as well as individuals. So yes, it functions on institutional levels, but it also functions on an individual level. I'll kind of come back a little bit more later. But in essence, what discourse analysis does for us is it does two main things. It helps us to understand how meaning is made. And if you look at a lot of the kind of literary analyses that you might find in the English department and things, they'll be wanting to know about how do people actually create their realities. And so one part of discourse analysis is, well, sort of what and how meaning is created and made. But the other really key point for discourse analysis, and the thing that it has that other techniques don't really address, is why that meaning is made. So a lot of kind of qualitative methods might get you the what and the how, but they won't really start answering the why. And in particular, it's a method that really is aimed at looking at the kind of social, psychological or political reasons for those 2 points. It doesn't really have much of a care for individuals. So if any of you are kind of familiar with phenomenological analysis, it's kind of the complete opposite. It's not necessarily particularly concerned with individual experience. It's concerned much more about institutionalised practices and how people act as a result of that, and analysing that. And one big reason, and there's a long, well, I say long, there's about 40-year tradition maybe, of using discourse analysis to bring about social and political change through bring about just novel analyses of data, basically, for want of a better word. And there's various theories that are applied in discourse analysis. Now, I did put capitalism last week when I was writing this, but actually I'm not quite sure whether that quite fits into post-structural discourse analysis, so my apologies for that. But basically, you're making... Oh yeah, come on. That's okay, that's okay. We're not right that far, don't worry. Basically, with nearly any form of discourse analysis, you need to have some understanding of what theoretical framework you're working with. So people might use Marxist theories to look at how is capitalism structuring these interactions, for example. And then when I went back to reading this, I was like, well, a lot of people would say Marxism isn't really postmodern. But I think you could use Marxism in the analysis in a postmodern way, but we don't need to go into that too much. There's then kind of theories that definitely come from post-structural theory, that look at things like race and ethnicity, so there's kind of post-colonial studies and things like that. There's theories on sexuality, on gender, masculinity and femininity, morality, which is a kind of one I use. And then there's the past few years people have been looking at this idea of temporality as well, and how we relate to time. Now, the thing that all these have in common, with possibly the exception of capitalism, is that it's trying to look at the central structuring themes of life and existence, and how we are made to carry on performing these, not necessarily explicitly. And that's the big thing about discourse analysis. It's the discourses that are structuring those conversations aren't always explicit by any means. And this is one of the big problems with discourse analysis, is that there aren't any hard and fast rules as to how you start looking at what discourses are actually occurring. So I'm going to try and show you how I did it, but actually the way I did it is kind of an amalgamation of at least two kind of people who've written about it, if not half a dozen. But if you actually engage in what you want to call post-structural discourse analysis, that's actually perfectly acceptable, because the whole point of post-structure is to give some challenge to the structures in society that dictate how we act and how we function. So it would be somewhat incongruent to talk about doing a post-structural discourse analysis and then following a rule book, because the whole point of a post-structural analysis is to try and break apart the rule book by which society or politics or people function. So it's not, there isn't a rule book, and there's not a rule book for good reason. And so if you're writing up in your PhD about why the hell you're not following a particular method, that's why you're not following a particular method if you're doing post-structural analysis, because you shouldn't be. Now, Michael Traynor is a bit of a naughty one for putting odd titles on things so they get high impact factors, has written a bit about postmodern research overall, and his words were, "No grounding or privilege, just free-floating troublemaking." Now, that sounds like a criticism and the title, and he intended that actually. It's meant to be a bit of a double entendre. But the whole point of postmodern, post-structural research is that it is free-floating. The whole idea is that you draw in a wide range of theory. And actually, yeah, we do want to be troublemaking. You'll very often read in people's research projects, they wanted to problematize or they wanted to trouble the concept of. So yeah, actually that's exactly what we're trying to achieve with this kind of analytical technique. We're wanting to trouble the topic that we're interested in. So as a very broad idea, there's another author called Gilles Deleuze, who's also French. A lot of them are French. And if you read French or English, it doesn't make any more sense a lot of what they write in any language. So if English isn't your native language and you struggle reading it in English, if you go to authors like Deleuze or Foucault and you think, oh, maybe I should try that in Spanish, or if it's, I can guarantee it won't make any more sense. So if you do end up reading these sorts of authors to inform the theoretical basis for your work, honestly, you will struggle with whatever language you read it in. I'm fairly competent in French, and there was a book in the library once that was only in French. The English language copy was out, so I was like, oh, I'll have a go at the French one, it'll be good. Didn't make a bit of sense. I was like, oh, it's probably because my French isn't good enough. So requested the English one, still didn't make any sense. So don't worry if you don't understand things. But basically, this chap Deleuze, he has this concept of how analysis should function. And you'll very often find in kind of research projects that you're trying to trace the logic of something. You're trying to kind of go, so these are the themes, and then this is where they come from, and this is the overall explanation. And Deleuze talks about that as kind of being an arborescent, in other words, like a tree. So it kind of funnels down to the roots, and you can trace the logic back and write a report and write an overall theme, and that is why this is happening. And he said, no, we shouldn't be doing that. That's the problem with kind of Western modernity. We don't want to be doing that. What Deleuze says is your analysis should be more like a rhizome. And what a rhizome is so you have trees that have roots and go up like that. And a rhizome is things like strawberries and raspberries, and they have these roots that go underground and connect with each other and kind of cross over, and that's how you get kind of weird hybrids of things. It says that's how our analysis should be, and that it stops repeating the same thing over and over again, and that's how you get innovative analyses. And he relates it actually to ethics, and he says that a lot of this comes out the post-World War II, which I don't need to go into, but he basically says that a lot of the problem with how conflict and things arise is that people go down their particular pathways and count as irrelevant any other possible connections and interpretations. And he says it's a better ethical way to live, to constantly be connecting with other ideas and other discourses. Now that's got some congruence with a lot of qualitative methods. So people like Glaser and Strauss and Kathy Sharmas in the grounded theory tradition, you might have heard, or ethnography, you might have heard the phrase all is data, or everything can be data. And certainly Deleuze would agree with that. But the real thing that you start introducing with post-structural discourse analysis is that not just everything is data, but everything is also potentially analysis as well. And there's not a binary between data and analysis. And that's one of the really important things. And a really easier way to talk about that is one of the books that I'd really recommend if you're interested in discourse analysis, because it's easy to read, is one by Jackson and Mazzei. They're American authors, but they've come over here fairly regularly. I think they've done research in the UK, and they certainly make sense. It's culturally fairly easy to get your head around. But they talk about this idea of plugging one text into another. And so just as everything is data, they start trying to say, well, actually, one text can be read through another.
So is that a double Z?
Yeah, Z-Z-E-I. Yes. Yeah. I've got the full reference at the end as well. So any references that are in here, I've got a bit of a reading list as well at the end. So you should be able to. No, it's fine. It's fine. Thank you. Now, so yes, you're plugging one text into another, but that implicitly means that you're trying to link theory with empirical data, and it means that because you can use anything for analysis and anything for data, you don't really get an explicit framework for analysis. You kind of get a way to progress. And the closest I've ever found to how we actually go about a discourse analysis, or almost a sort of set of rules, is from their book. And they give a few kind of broad pointers that are very helpful. And what they ask in their questions is, how have these particular discourses arisen? What versions of reality do they construct, make possible and exclude? What competing discourses are available? And why have these discourses emerged now, and what sustains them? So to relate this back to kind of how it differs to other methods, is what versions of reality do they, the discourses, construct, make possible and exclude? That's one of the really important points, and kind of one of the cornerstones really of a post-structural discourse analysis, is you're not just looking for what's there, you're also looking for what's not there. And I'll give you an example of what's not there later on. But by applying different theoretical frameworks, it can make you start thinking about, okay, so what is this reality, and how are these discourses structuring a reality in such a way to stop alternative viewpoints going about? And then the second thing, which links to that, is why have these discourses emerged now, and what sustains them? And that's the other key thing with post-structural discourse analysis, is that it doesn't see discourses as being foundational and there and true. It sees that they constantly have to be sustained. So a fairly straightforward example of that is looking at gender. And there's a whole range of gender theory that says actually gender isn't fixed, it's a social expression, but not only is it social expression, we have to constantly perform gender. And that's one of the theories about, it's not just what is there, what versions of reality are there. Yes, we can say there's a version of reality that is masculine and feminine, but what is it that sustains that? Because post-structuralism very much says nothing is in itself true. So it very much goes away from kind of people like Aristotle. It says everything that structures life has to constantly be performed. So that will be things like gender, sexuality, age, race, ethnicity. And that's a big important point, that we're not only looking at what discourses there are, but we're looking at what sustains them. So from the example of gender, not to give you a lecture on gender theory, but a lot of the arguments would be around kind of patriarchy and things like that sustain a gender binary. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail because it's really going off piece what I'm talking about, but that's a big difference for post-structural discourse analysis. So what is it actually useful for? Because it's not useful for certain things as well. As I think I'm hopefully starting to convey, that it's really useful if you want a critical analysis, if you're wanting to rethink how society or politics or psychology functions, or sometimes an interface of all three of those. It doesn't stand a chance of being able to produce quantifiable figures. That is not what it does. And it wouldn't really be used to produce any sort of proof. I'm not going to go into if you want to ask me about it later, you can. But for the purpose of this talk and the time we've got, it doesn't really suggest causation. And there's some people might want to argue with me about that, and it's an arguable point. But I would say that discourse analysis doesn't tell you causation, because a lot of that would be trying to trace a logic, and post-structural discourse analysis is all about not tracing logic. It's about tracing what maintains things. So it's a fine distinction though. It's great for academic debate. you can get into really deep, complex philosophy with your empirical data. But from the point of view of trying to then get that into policy and practice, because a lot of your reading of your data will come from very abstract theory, and it's often not everyday understandings of society and politics, it can mean it's quite unintelligible to people that then go and read it who haven't got the same academic background as you. So it can be useful to rethink things, but if you're then hoping to engage in changing policy or practice or anything like that, you will tend to find that you have to sacrifice some of your more outlandish findings, maybe, or arguments, to be able to engage with the broader policy agenda. And some of the more abstract points that you make might not quite be makeable in a succinct way. So it is not necessarily a weakness, but I'm just saying it's hard to produce those policy links. And for example, my PhD thesis had very little to do with policy, but my funders wanted a policy-focused report. I almost had to start from scratch because it was like two separate pieces of work. The data was the same, some of the points were the same, but I couldn't make overall the same arguments because there was too much theory enmeshed in it. I don't know what it's like in your field. I think geography people don't talk about interdisciplinarity a lot. And I think from discourse analysis provides a really good framework for an interdisciplinary discussion, because by its nature you're trying to reach across in that kind of rhizomatic way to other theories. So it does kind of lend itself to being able to work in a disciplinary way. And it's great for developing theory as well. But as we've already said, the key thing about it is moving away from a word-to-word, word-for-word analysis of the text, and really you're trying to look between the lines at why these stories are functioning in the way they are. So, now we've got a kind of basic understanding of what discourse analysis is vaguely useful for. I just want to kind of give you an example of how it works and how it worked in my PhD thesis and a couple of publications I've done. Now, from the point of view of what you can analyse, it's almost endless, and I've added a couple of things on since I wrote this, not on there. But my study majored on interviews. I did give people diaries, but because it was palliative care, none of them actually filled them out. They didn't feel well enough. I've known people do discourse analysis on observation data. Plenty of people do it on literature, and by that I mean everything from kind of classical literature like Charlotte Bronte all the way down to the Daily Mail. I do consider the Daily Mail the absolute pits of literature. People will equally look at film. I did have a section about film in my thesis, but it got ripped out because the whole chapter could be put in the space of a paragraph. But people will do discourse analysis of films, of diaries, ephemera, and by that I mean kind of things like posters and just paper materials that aren't necessarily diaries, but they're things that you can hold. Archive materials in general, so you might see statues or books or postcards or photographs, and there's plenty of people who've done that. Artworks, I've seen people do discourse analyses on. Poetry, I haven't put there, so people certainly do it on that. Maps from geographers, I've seen people do examples of discourse analysis on mapping and maps. The one that I haven't put on there is material culture. People will often do a discourse analysis of that. There's a huge range of things that are amenable to looking at discourse analysis. So just as a brief example maybe, if you were to take this chair, you would kind of look at it and say, well, the discourse of this chair is not something to relax on. So it's kind of there for function, it's got a little bit of back support, but you're looking at kind of a functional thing, it's not a city-roundy, relaxy sort of thing. And so what is this kind of, what are the discourses informing this chair? Well, it's kind of a little bit of comfort, but mainly it's to bring people in, sit people down for a short time, and maybe kind of absorb some knowledge. But it's not the height of sophistication. It's not from John Lewis. It's not from Harrods. And it's then you see it's mass-produced, so you might get into ideas of capitalism and all that sort of thing. Very briefly, just come out and not on the spot. But the point is that you can look at anything and see how it's put together, what discourses inform that, and a lot of that will be to do with the theoretical framework that's come before, as to whether you're looking at ideas of capitalism or feminism or anything like that. I can't think of anyone who's done a feminist analysis of chairs, but there's probably something out there. Probably is. So, as I say, just to kind of give you a better idea of where my study came from, I was doing interviews with patients and their family carers, so not a professional carer, about their experiences of district nursing, home care nursing, if you're not British. And they talked about their experiences, what they thought gave quality to their care, interviewed most of them separately. And then I had to have some way of organising and developing these interviews. Now, there is a bit of a divide, and I think it's a bit of a divide as whether you're a Luddite or not, of organising your data. And there are pros and cons as to how you might organise any data. The electronic one, I used a software package called NVivo. Have people heard of that? Yeah? Okay. Right, so I don't need to start from scratch on that. And there's many, many, many pros to NVivo. You can back it up. So if your computer gets stolen, you don't lose everything. If your house burns down, you don't lose everything. Back it up to the university server, I'd recommend. They're quite big files, but if you explain to IT that you're doing this, they'll normally accommodate you. It's fairly easy to reverse changes. It's portable, so if you're using your computer and you're travelling, if you're on a train, you can still work with it. You don't have to carry a load of transcripts around with you. And it allows as well, this is a big strength I think, when we look at the previous slide, when you're looking at a vast range of data and trying to collect it all in, NVivo allows you literally to tag pictures and images and audio, and they all kind of look the same in your list at the end. I'll show you an example from interviews, but for me, because I did do some analysis of film, I found that a really useful feature, that all my different themes and all my different ideas could really easily be brought together no matter what material they were. One of the cons is that you've got to make sure, if it's on a computer, you've got to make sure it's encrypted if you're using data which is confidential. So if you're doing interviews or videos of people, you need to make sure your laptop's encrypted. It's something IT will happily do for you. It doesn't cost you anything. NVivo does. Oh no, I think NVivo's site licensed now. So if you've got a university computer, you can get it for free. Added onto it. It can I suppose NVivo can be hard to function, but there are training courses at the university. There are external training courses that I'd really recommend if you're thinking of using it. It's 2 days. It's about 500 quid, but if you can crowbar any money out of someone to go on the QSR are the people that run it, that make the package, and it's not as hard to function as you think. You do learn it quite quickly. Some people would say it's maybe a bit less creative, and I can see where people are coming from with that. There were points when I was doing my analysis where I printed things out and kind of had them round me and highlighted, but then once I got my ideas clear, I put them back onto kind of an electronic format. But I do think to an extent, sometimes you've got a bit of a blockage and you want to just see everything. You can't, because it's on a small computer screen, you can't kind of bring all the data in front of you in one place. So sometimes there's a role for paper and just printing things out and trying to make some connections to help with creativity. But a big con, and I think it's the biggest con with any sort of paper-based analysis, is that you can easily lose it. You can't really keep it with you, and again, if it's confidential, you've got to make sure it's locked away in an appropriate way for data protection, which usually means in a locked room, in a locked cupboard. It's a sort of university standard. But if it's on your laptop just needs to be encrypted, and that's enough. So, this is stand up for this bit. This is an example of the analysis. Now, unfortunately, you get one really annoying thing. I don't know if they've updated it since, but you get different colours here, but they don't translate to the text colours, which is a bit annoying. But anyway, it's not actually a screenshot I wanted to show you, but it's the only one I could get to work. So this is an example of how I actually went about doing some of the analysis. So it's a short bit of the transcript of an interview, and it's one of my patients talking about their care with the district nursing and what kind of future care they think they might have, basically. So this bit here, the district nurses are always there if I need them, which they will eventually be involved a lot with him, and that's the carer saying that. And so here, I then have a little tag that care acknowledged that DNs will be involved a lot in the future. And then the patient agrees with that, oh, it's going to come. So I tag that again. Patient, actually statical coding, but you know, we'll tag in Facebook. So patient acknowledges increasing role for district nurses in the future. And then down here, I sort of say, so what sort of care do you think you're going to have from them in the future? And we find out that district nurses, and this is almost the only person that did, district nurses did discuss the future care with them. And they talk about washing and dressing in the future. So then I have kind of a bunch of codes that relate to care and future care. And across all my interviews, I asked pretty much everybody, what do you think is going to happen in the future? How do you think district nurses can help you? Because these were people who had life-limiting illnesses. They were going to die from the illness that they had within sort of, all but one of them probably within a year. So it's quite interesting for me to find out, well, what care do you think you can get in the future? And then with these, I could then bring, because it's in vivo, I could then bring all those discussions of future care together and see what people are actually talking about in the future. And that gets me to the first kind of step of the discourse analysis of what is going on. Now, different people have different views on this. When I was interviewing, I very much saw the interview process and the analysis of that, so the data collection and the data analysis, as a kind of iterative thing. So I would go and interview people. Normally, I normally try to do some preliminary analysis on the interviews before I went and interviewed someone else. But I didn't always do that because it wasn't always practically possible, because if I didn't get to people quickly, they died. So there's some pragmatics in it. But I felt that if people were raising pertinent issues, I wanted to be able to then pursue them with future participants, because again, I couldn't go back to the same people because they became too ill too quickly, basically. So I had to expand my interview protocol and ask different people to expand on topics that were gradually emerging. So I went away and did kind of analysis like this. So in my original interview protocol, I didn't have anything about future care, but by about the 6th interview, it was apparent that actually that was something important. So, because I went through this process of analysis as I was interviewing, I ended up with 3 different protocols. So really, it's not what they looked like, but it's just a kind of graphical representation of it. So this was kind of the first iteration, and then it became apparent that there were other things that people were talking about, so I wanted to explore that in more depth with other people, and then eventually it kind of went into the final one, which included all 3 of those. So it's kind of iteration 1 was just that, iteration 2 was that, and then iteration 3 was all 3 of them. And that was kind of a formal rewriting of the interview protocol that I took with me. There was, of course, kind of informal things going on in my head at the time, but it would have been impractical to have rewritten the interview protocol for every interview. It would have given an appendices like of itself, like you could have done a whole binding of appendices otherwise. So I didn't formally rewrite it every interview, but I did do 3 iterations of it, roughly after about every 6 interviews, but that wasn't a numerical decision, it was just kind of the way I actually managed to do it. But I do feel one of the authors I recommended, the Jackson and Mazzei one, they didn't do that, and they just had their kind of set interview protocol and went with it. And I didn't feel that was kind of a acceptable way to go about it for me, because there was very little known about the topic. I felt I needed to be able to expand on things. And then as a part of this process, you go, well, if you're collecting data, when do you know the right time to collect data? When do you know you've got to the end of collecting data? And there's this kind of idea of data saturation. Have people heard of that? Yeah. Yeah. So that's exactly the traditional kind of understanding of data saturation, that you've got your themes, and once your themes keep on coming up again, you can stop. Now that's post-structural discourse analysis kind of goes, hang on a minute, that's not all that we're interested in. So the thing that I really want to draw your attention to is that, yes, instead of considering when data saturation, the themes are all there, because right at the beginning, we're not interested in just what the themes are. We're interested in what sustains them, in what makes people perform in that way, what discourses are informing it. So from a post-structural point of view, we need to also make sure that our saturation, we reach saturation when we've been able to explain the reasons why these themes appeared stable and have been established. So it's not just that the same themes keep on coming up, like not knowing anything about future care, or, as I'll come on to, district nurses are constantly seen as busy. You have to have some idea that you're actually gaining an understanding of why those themes are stable and what's sustaining those themes as a stable set of themes, rather than just what the themes are. So, this is an example of how I actually went about developing my analysis. And it's this idea of writing memos. I don't think I've got any pages left. I'm just looking at time. Yeah, they're all right. So I wrote about this idea of busyness and how that was very clearly structuring the way people thought about district nurses. So 17 out of 26 participants mentioned the word busy or busyness in their interviews. And that's actually that's not even including kind of all the synonyms for that word of like rushed or hurried. The actual word busy or busyness came up in 17 out of 26 interviews, which was interesting. So then I started seeing, well, actually that is a discourse. The idea of busyness being hurried, being rushed, is actually something that's structuring these patients' discussions and their experiences of district nursing care and quality. And so when I write about this is almost an extant discourse and almost something that's performed, and I go on to look at the fact that busyness, I haven't really got it in there, but you can see I've got the idea that there is this discourse of busyness. Sorry, I'm moving ahead a bit. But it's not just in the interviews that people are coming out with. This is when I went to look at media representations of business, so looking at newspapers and how nursing functions, and that everyone's always very hurried. So I actually saw that this idea of business isn't just something that patients talk about and they experience, it's actually something that precedes their contact with district nurses as well. And that idea of district nurses being busy, or at least healthcare professionals being busy, was something that circulates in society at a broader level. So when we go back to that first quote about Foucault, the institutions and the way that discourse functions, the discourse of business is really easy to pick up when you're looking at newspapers and films and even some literature. But then, when I look at the interviews, there are a couple of different ways. So occasionally, district nurses came and said, oh, I've been really busy, and explicitly used that word with patients. But more often than not, the idea of busyness was just, it was read as district nurses being busy. So when they were disorganised, they didn't chat, they didn't have a drink when they're offered a cup of tea, they had poor timekeeping, they were only short visits. Instead of it being something like, oh, the district nurse doesn't like me, so she's not talking to me, which is perfectly reasonable, it's a logical thing, someone doesn't like me, they don't talk to you. Actually, it traced back to this idea that district nurses were busy, even if very often the district they hadn't reported the district nurses saying they were busy. So the idea of busyness as a discourse started explaining all these things here, even though it wasn't an absolute logical conclusion. And then I started looking at, okay, so what effects does that have? And this then starts linking it to the ethics of care, which was kind of my central thing that I was reading a lot of this through. So it's this idea of having this rhizome, you have your idea of busyness in the middle, and you're trying to look at, okay, so you've got busyness, how is that structuring people's experiences? And you kind of reach out to a whole range of texts. So what is the ethical experience of that? What's the experience on people's ability and identity and how they form their identity? Those are, I can't remember where I put them on. But the whole point is that at the end, I kind of came up, this is a very short bit there, of rethinking the ethics of care, because the whole point I was trying to do is to think about ethics, and people like Deleuze and Guattari talk about an ethical being is where you're able to develop in new ways, experience new things, understand yourself in novel ways. They use the phrase becoming other, and the other part is other discourses coming to form you. So I came up with this in the end, is one of my findings. Ethical care is beginning to be recognised as care that counts the views of those at the receiving end of care. However, in the context of palliative supportive district nursing care, the patients and their carers' views are seldom heard. And the post-structural discourse analysis is used to examine how discourses operate on a moral level, and one discourse, busyness, is argued to preclude a moral form of nursing. And basically, the reason why it precludes a moral form of nursing is because patients ended up self-policing and not asking for things like psychological care, even though they needed it, because of this idea of busyness. So chatting, getting psychological support, even though when I asked them, do you have issues that you think district nurses might be able to address? Oh yeah, have you talked with them? No, I haven't. Why not? Oh, it's because I'm busy. Because they are so busy. So that goes then back to the idea of Deleuze and Guattari that an ethical form of care is where people are allowed to express, become other, be someone with more than just the need of a wound dressing or something like that. And so that then makes you start thinking about the interaction and this declaration of quality as very different. So it allows you a kind of different reading of quality care when we're talking about busyness. Because actually the patients would very often say, oh, she's brilliant, she will come and do anything for me. But then when you actually ask, well, what was anything, they have no idea what else district nurses could do, because they never had the opportunity to have those conversations because the district nurses were busy. So that's how it kind of structured them, the subjectivity and their care, in what I argue is an unethical way. And I'll very quickly run through one other example, just to kind of show you how you can link really different theory and, as I was saying earlier, plug in one text into another. So I was looking at how patients, this is not one of my patients, it's a picture I've got permission to use, so how patients and nurses interacted in the homes. Might be more interesting to the geographers maybe. And one of the things that was very clear in the interviews was that district nurses actually, if you think about the home as a discourse and the care as a discourse, and can't get away from the materiality of it, sorry, but the home, district nurses kind of become enmeshed in it, and they become part of the home and what sustains the home, because without the district nurses, they wouldn't get the care that they needed to be at home with. And then I was reading this book, which is by a chap called Tim Dean, who talks about gay men's sex in New York and how buildings affect what relationships people are able to have in bars and things like that. And his argument is that the state sanctions what can and can't happen in bars. So he looks at New York and San Francisco, and in the States you've got very different laws enacted in those two cities. And he looks at what relationships are allowed to occur depending on what laws are functioning in those material spaces. so that then brought me back saying, okay, so laws, and he talks about in an ethical way of like people not being able to pursue the relationships that they actually want to pursue, or explore alternative relationships in New York that they can in San Francisco. And he talks about that as being an ethical matter. So then that makes me think, okay, what laws are functioning in the state in relation to people's care at home? And it became apparent that actually people weren't being given opportunities to explore different ways of having care, different setups of care, because of these very extant laws. And one of the key things is that it very much depended on what condition someone had, but then when you dug a bit deeper, the structuring part of that, so the structuring discourse of what said whether they could or couldn't have care at home, was what was medical best practice. So it's very much medical discourses that then decided whether someone could or couldn't be at home. It wasn't the patient's choice or desire to stay at home. It was whether they were going to get the best medical care. And my point is that best medical care might not be what this person wants, but very few people, there was only 2 people who had any say in it, and they were actually former district nurses. Very few people had any say in how their home was set up and how their relationship to the home was set up. It was set up basically as whether we can give you the best medical care or not. And nurses weren't in any way trying to explore or advocate what patients wanted or desired, even though sometimes it was very clear that the patient wanted to be at home and would happily sacrifice months and years of life to be at home. And there was some suggestions that people had slightly engaged in these conversations, but generally it was cut off because of this idea of medical best practice. So that's how you can link really disparate ideas to your text. And that's what discourse analysis really allows you to do, to kind of look at what's the message from one text here, what's some of the theory that's going on over here, and how can I apply it to my area. And it's not saying that you've got to be reading something about healthcare or district nurses to interpret your data. You really can kind of bring in one text and another text and link them together. So I've got a reading list here. I've tried to split it up into basic introductions. That's a journal. Oh no, it's not a journal article, but it's quite a short paper. That's a good introduction. I would start with Erica Berman and Ian Parker. It's a very well edited and well written book. It is a bit old, but it's extremely well written. They come from the psychology department over at MMU. Ian Parker's not there anymore, but that's a long story. But Erica Berman is still there, and if you're interested in discourse analysis, I think there is still a thing called the discourse unit that runs at MMU. I haven't been for a while, but that's where I learn a lot of these things. If you want to progress and you think, yeah, this is really the sort of thing I'm interested in, I really recommend the Jackson and Mazzei book. They look at basically different theorists. So they will look at people like Foucault, Butler, Deleuze, and how, this is the interesting thing, if you want to go, okay, so how does different theory interpret my data differently? They actually go through almost a set interview and apply different theorists in each chapter. So if you want to understand how different theoretical frameworks and different ways of, maybe for yourself, knowledge and power function, it's a really good book. It's really clearly written. Lisa Jackson will very happily respond to emails. Julian Cheek is a sort of nursing academic, as much a nursing academic as I am. That's a short paper, and it kind of is a review of discourse analysis, more in healthcare. And then those are a few examples. So I've got my own paper on there. Sorry. This one, so that's interview based. The Holmes one is observation based, and then this one, the last paper, is a discourse analysis, but it's one that relies much more on policy and newspapers and things like that. So it's more of a kind of documentary discourse analysis, one that uses documents rather than empirical data that you have produced. So it's kind of a secondary data set that they're analysing in that one. So it's kind of 3 different papers. And I think that will kind of show you the variety of sources that you can use. and they're all easy to read. There are other ones that I could suggest, but some of the authors can sometimes get a little bit over the top. So, but yeah, the conclusion, everything is data, but also you plug in to alternative and disparate text, and that's really encouraged in discourse analysis. It does tend to weigh to a moderate or a large degree on theory. So if you're not the sort of person that want to read theory at all, it's probably not a good method for you. But if I saw someone saying I'm doing a discourse analysis and there was no discussion of theoretical frameworks in it whatsoever, that would concern me. Because even the non-postmodern, post-structural ones tend to have some consideration of theory. It's very strongly functions well if you're wanting to function in an interdisciplinary way, if you wanted to draw in a wide range of data. But as I said, it's not. If you're trying to do something that engages with public, you will have to then rethink your language and your findings for kind of a public engagement sort of thing. It's possible, I've done it, but not really focused on what I'm talking about today. But if your project is primarily public engagement focused, you'll have to do a lot more work after your analysis to then kind of almost interpret it for public consumption.